Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Dr. John Moyle with the University of Maryland Extension, and this is another one of our February weekly Flock Fridays. This week we have Dr. Tatiana Fisher with us from Lincoln University in Missouri, and she's going to talk to us today about Coccidia and some other internal parasites. Over to you, Tatiana.
So I'm going to say good morning because I'm on Central Time and it's 11 a.m. here. So good morning, everybody, and thanks for joining. Apologies in advance to anybody who is eating lunch while watching. There will be some not so pretty pictures. Not too many, but there are definitely going to be a couple of slides that are less than appetizing. So I am based in Jefferson City, Missouri, and work at Lincoln University, which is an 1890s historically Black university. And I work largely with small flocks throughout the state of Missouri, but I have previously lived in Kentucky, where I actually grew up, and also spent a little bit of time in Minnesota. I have visited Maryland, but I've never actually lived there. But most of this stuff is pretty universal. So I have a handful of disclaimers, mostly kind of boilerplate stuff. We don't have any discrimination against anybody for really any reason. You can read the actual text if you want. I might talk about brand names if I do, or I mention specific commercial products. It's just for educational purposes, and it's not an endorsement by my university or by University of Maryland. It might be an endorsement by me personally, but not professionally. Also, we are going to be talking about health information. This is information that's going to be for informational purposes. It's not to be taken as veterinary advice. If you do suspect that your chickens have intestinal parasites or other internal parasites, consult your veterinarian, particularly before you use anything that's not labeled for poultry. A lot of medications have certain withholding times, and they may be different for eggs, they may be different for meat. And so that's something that you want to consider, and we'll talk about that again later on in the presentation. So just to give you an idea of kind of what we're going to talk about, we'll start with some general concerns, looking at clinical signs that are consistent across most parasite infections for chickens. We'll talk about prevention methods, some common internal parasites. We'll focus on Coccidia because that's probably the one that you're the most likely to deal with, but we'll also talk about some other ones. And then we will talk about some testing and treatment considerations, and there will be some time at the end for questions. So the biggest concern with internal parasites is that they compete with the bird for nutrients. So in most cases, a lot of the ones we're going to talk about live in the intestines. Some live in other parts of the body, but ultimately they compete with the bird for nutrition, and they can reduce the growth of the bird. They can reduce egg production. They also often increase susceptibility to other diseases because they weaken the bird. Now, having said that, mild infestations may not actually cause any problems. They can often live with a small worm load and it be fine, but severe infestations can also be more of an issue and cause intestinal blockages, death, and that kind of thing, which is obviously not something we want to deal with. So clinical signs of internal parasites are unfortunately pretty non-specific. So for most of them, you will see weight loss, maybe a loss of appetite, pale face from some if the bird has become anemic, abnormal droppings. So here's one of our pretty pictures of some diarrhea from I believe these are all from Coccidia infections. Ruffled feathers and kind of a depressed looking bird. So this bird on the screen is one that looks kind of on the young side, but is all hunched up, and you can see like that's an abnormal stance. If I see a bird like that, I'm going to suspect that there is something wrong and it is sick. It could be parasites, it could be something else, but I'm definitely going to do some investigation. One thing to think about when we're thinking about how do we prevent parasite infections is understanding the life cycle of the parasites. So I've got a handful listed here. These are all ones we'll talk about at least briefly. But in general, there's two different methods of infection. One is that the parasite or parasite eggs are deposited in the bird's feces, and another bird either picks them up directly from consuming feed or foraging around those feces, or it can be indirect, and those parasite eggs can be consumed by an intermediate host, such as a snail or earthworm, and then the chicken eats that intermediate host, and that is what then gets the bird infected. So some parasites are only transmitted directly, some can be transmitted both ways, and others are only transmitted indirectly because of how the life cycle of the parasite actually works. And we'll talk a little bit about some of those later. So in general, if you take nothing else from this presentation, prevention is the most important thing. We want to, so you can conduct routine fecal exams for your flock to look for parasite eggs. Ideally, we would do fecal tests on any new birds while they're being quarantined and before they've been, before they have had contact with your existing flock. We want to segregate birds by age groups whenever possible. In a lot of cases, young birds are more susceptible to infection by internal parasites than older birds. Older birds may have developed an immunity over time. And so the old birds are a risk to the young birds. Overcrowding is always an issue. If you've got too many birds in a small space, you have a lot of feces that can build up, and those birds are almost forced to interact with it. One thing that can be kind of hard in small flocks, but I always encourage, is to discourage your birds from eating on the ground. So in most cases, the feces is going to be found on the ground. And so if the feed is also on the ground, you're encouraging your birds to eat potentially infected feed. So always use some kind of a feeder for the majority of their feed. Obviously, they're going to do some pecking on the ground anyway, but we use hanging feeders. But there's lots of different ways to have a feeder that birds can eat out of, and that keeps their feces and their food separate. You always want to keep your equipment and your coop as clean as possible. Change bedding out as needed. Remove chicken droppings. It's not mentioned here, but it will be mentioned later. Also, keep things dry. So especially like in the winter season where it might you have a lot of freezing and thawing. I'll notice that our pens need bedding added more frequently so that they don't end up being muddy and wet. And that protects the birds both from parasites and also from things like frostbite with having moisture in the pens. You always want to also rotate your outdoor areas that you use for poultry. Some of the internal parasite species can last for a long time in the environment, but some of them don't. So it helps to basically have one space that you use for a while and then move the birds to using another space. And that can be done with temporary fencing if you don't want to have permanent runs set up. So the common internal parasites of chickens that you'll generally read about are Coccidia, roundworms, and there's a couple of different kinds. Large roundworms are what you're probably going to be the most likely to come in contact with your chickens. Cecal worms, also threadworms, are a type of roundworm. Tapeworms, I have had people contact me with pictures that were very obviously tapeworms. I'll show you one of those pictures later. Gapeworm, which is one that's actually not very common, but you'll see a lot of people talk about it online, so we will talk about it. And then flukes, which are also one that's not super common, but they do come up. So first, we'll talk about Coccidia. And like I said, this is probably the one that you are most likely to encounter with your flock. So Coccidia is a protozoan parasite. So it's a pretty tiny little organism. It lives in the intestinal lining of the chicken, and it can cause disease of that intestinal tract. And we call the disease that it causes coccidiosis. This is one of the most expensive and common diseases actually of commercial poultry. And where it becomes really expensive is that a severe infection can lead to necrotic enteritis, which is basically a secondary infection that can cause very severe disease in the birds. This picture shows that there's different species. So Coccidia is a group of Eimeria species, and they infect different parts of the intestinal tract. And this just shows where some of those different parts are and what species. In general, from a small lot perspective, I'm not worried about the specific species. They're all kind of treated the same way. So Coccidia is transmitted directly. So an infected bird sheds the eggs from the coccidia in their feces, contaminates the environment. Those then go through a sporulation process and they become infective. Then the other birds ingest those eggs either while drinking or eating or while pecking around their environment. Those then colonize the new bird and leads to infection. So this can be spread by birds that are in direct contact with each other. It can also be spread through litter. So even if you have, let's say, adult birds that you have moved out of a coop, but now you're moving in babies into a coop that has previously had chickens in it, it can also be transmitted to those new ones, even though those new birds did not interact with the old birds. It also can come through egg contamination from parent flocks, although I would tell you that's not going to typically be your problem if you're getting chicks from good sources. Coccidiosis is usually diagnosed through a series of things, starting with your observations of your bird. So if you see that they're standing hunched up with ruffled feathers, they've got kind of a pale comb, their droppings don't look right, they're eating and drinking less, that's a good sign that you have a sick bird and it might be coccidiosis. If somebody calls me and they have sick birds and this is what they describe to me, I'll ask about some history. So one of the histories that will tell me to suspect coccidia is if they've recently gotten new birds, or if they have young birds that have now been exposed. The young birds are sick after being exposed to older birds. Some clinical signs can be, we'll talk about, the next slide will show some of those. You can do a fecal float test to look for the eggs of the coccidia, and on necropsy, there would be some things that we could also see. Now, necropsy obviously requires a dead bird, and I'll show a couple of pictures from the internal from necropsies of coccidiosis birds in a minute. So clinical signs, again, these are kind of non-specific, but if you see a number of your birds kind of hunched up, that posture, bloody diarrhea is often a sign of coccidiosis versus something else. So that's one where if you see blood in diarrhea from chickens, suspect coccidiosis first generally. But any sign where they're decreasing in their feed or water, they're not growing very well, they're losing weight, all of those can be signs. Also, coccidiosis can kill the birds. So if there's a high flock mortality, again, especially among young birds, I might suspect coccidiosis. On a fecal flotation test, you'll see the cocci eggs like this. You might see one or two, that's probably not an issue. If you see a ton on a screen, that's when we're going to definitely lean towards treating. Here are those necropsy pictures. So these are all pictures of parts of the digestive tract, and you can see a more mild infection in the top picture, and the other two are very severe lesions that are bloody and look pretty gross, for lack of a better term there. So factors contributing to coccidiosis outbreaks, mixed age flocks. So like I mentioned, older birds can often already develop an immunity, but young birds will be susceptible. High litter moisture can encourage coccidia. Immunosuppression, so if you've got birds that are sick for other reasons, or if they're stressed due to overstocking or high temperatures, extreme low temperatures, anything that causes extra stress to the bird. And the other thing can be using a suboptimal level of an anticoccidial. So we'll talk about treatment and prevention next. I also just want to call attention to this lovely picture that Meta AI came up with for me of a chicken coop. I don't know that any of our chicken coops look like that, but if yours ever does, let somebody know and clean it up. The prevention, pretty much the opposite of some of those factors. So keep your environment dry, don't overcrowd the birds, minimize contact between your chickens and their feces, provide fresh, clean water. And here's what we're talking about in terms of prevention through medication. So one option when you purchase chick feed is to purchase something called medicated chick feed. And that medication is almost always going to be amprolium, which is an anticoccidial drug. And it can be used in either feed or water. Obviously, in this case, we're talking about feed. So this feed is intended to provide a low dose for prevention to help young birds develop that immunity that they need. You can buy chick feed that doesn't include amprolium, but you can also buy, obviously, that it does. Always check to make sure that that is the medication if you are looking at medicated feed, but I would be willing to bet that most medicated feed, if not all medicated feed available in like your average farm supply store, is going to be medicated with amprolium. So the treatment is actually similar to the prevention method and also uses amprolium. In most cases, we're going to use Corid, which you'll notice is not listed for chickens specifically, but you'll use a low dose for prevention, and there's a therapeutic dose for treatment. And I'm not going to provide those actual doses, but they're pretty easy to find if you do some searching. So we'll talk about some other internal parasites that chickens can get. Roundworms are probably the most common intestinal worm in a backyard chicken or free-range flocks. They can be, typically they're transmitted directly, but I believe they can also be transmitted indirectly. The challenge with roundworms is their eggs can survive in the soil for months. So a typical like 2 or 3 week rotation is not going to help you eliminate roundworms. One of the extra precautions we can take, in addition to our initial prevention methods, is to make sure that the chicken's diet contains vitamin A and B in sufficient quantities. So you'll see that our clinical signs here are pretty similar to what we see just in general. Diagnosis here typically is going to be through a fecal test, but also in a severe infestation, you may see actual roundworms in the feces. And roundworms are pretty big, so you will not question them when you see them. Make sure that you're looking at fresh droppings and that it's not something where you're looking at like an earthworm or something that has come up out of the soil. But roundworms are pretty distinctive in their appearance. Another one that can be pretty distinctive and that we can visually see are tapeworms. They are flat, ribbon-shaped, segmented intestinal worms. They are very prolific and I wouldn't necessarily say super common, but they are prolific in that if you have them, quickly all of your birds are going to have them. They anchor themselves to the intestinal wall and reduce the nutrient absorption for the bird. These require an indirect transmission by an intermediate host. So usually this is flies, beetles, or earthworms. And this is one of the reasons why, as much as we want our chickens to be able to live their full lives and consume bugs and grubs and things, there are some dangers to that. So the extra precaution we can take here is to prevent access to those intermediate hosts. Again, our clinical signs are pretty typical of any other internal parasite, with one kind of difference in that you'll see oftentimes weight loss despite the fact that the bird is eating well. And also fun. So this is actually a picture that a local Missouri farmer sent me asking, what are these little grain things in my chicken's poop? Those are tapeworm segments. And at this stage, this is a picture, so you can't see them moving around, but I would promise you they were still moving around when she took this picture. So if you find a video of this same kind of picture, you'll actually see that those little segments are moving. So this is one we can visually see in the droppings, but also you can see on a fecal test. Cecal worms are an internal parasite that infest the ceca. These are an issue largely in that they can carry the protozoan parasite Histomonas meleagritis, that causes blackhead disease in turkeys. So this is one of the reasons we don't actually want to keep chickens and turkeys together. These thrive on the ground or litter, particularly in overcrowded bird enclosures, and they can be transmitted directly or indirectly. Typically, they don't cause a lot of problems in chickens. We want to keep our chickens and turkeys separated because they will cause issues for the turkeys more so. And they're pretty small little worms. Diagnosis is typically going to be through a fecal test. Another one that we can sometimes see are thread worms. These are also sometimes called hair worms or small round worms. Different species impact different parts of the chicken's body. These are also can be transmitted directly or indirectly, with earthworm being the typical indirect host. So we want to ideally restrict our chickens' access to earthworms. You'll sometimes see more like head flicking and swallowing issues. So this might affect more of the kind of upper digestive tract more so than, but it can also cause issues in the lower digestive tract. Here we're going to mostly see this as a diagnosis in fecal tests. I mentioned gapeworm at the beginning, that I see people almost always online, their bird is like shaking its head or just making kind of weird head movements, and the assumption almost always is that they have gapeworm, but I haven't actually seen true cases of gapeworm very much. It's really not that common in my experience, and I think the birds that people online say have gapeworm, they've got something else going on, because most of the time those people have not done any kind of testing. So this is a parasitic nematode that can be found in the trachea of domestic and wild birds, and they do infect quite a few wild birds, but less so in domestic poultry. It is indirect transmission. They consume larvae that are in the environment, and they can also consume earthworms or slugs. So again, treating soil and preventing access to earthworms, snails, slugs can help to prevent this. The clinical signs here are going to be mostly related to the head region, gasping for air, having difficulty breathing, coughing, head shaking. But note that this is something, if you see it and it's kind of transient, probably not caused by gapeworm, probably caused by a respiratory infection or something. If a bird has gapeworm, it's not going to just get better on its own. So here's a picture of the trachea of a bird opened up, showing these gapeworms on the attached to the trachea wall. Testing here is going to be fecal testing will show the eggs of the gapeworm in the feces. So then we have flukes, which are trematodes. These are sometimes found in free-range poultry, but they're more common in waterfowl than they are in chickens. These require a snail as an intermediate host, and your signs again are pretty non-specific, not eating, weight loss. There is unfortunately pretty much no treatment for these. Now we will talk about treatment considerations in general for other species of parasite, but flukes are something that don't really have any treatment that can work for us. So treatment considerations. Start by talking about the fact that we are going to want to do some routine fecal testing and monitoring. This can help us with early detection, but mostly is important because it can target our treatment. It can tell us what we're actually dealing with. So fecal testing is going to involve collecting fresh feces, doing a fecal float, and using a microscope to look at the sample. This is something that you can have a veterinarian do, but you can also, it doesn't take a particularly expensive setup to manage, so you can learn to do this on your own. There is a video that I've linked here that you can go to, and it walks you through kind of how this process works. But this is definitely something, if you've got birds, and honestly, if you have other farm animals, it's very helpful to be able to do on your own so that you don't have to pay for a test for all your birds all the time. So the biggest challenge that we run into when we talk about treating birds is that chickens are food animals. Even if you have no intentions of eating your specific chickens, they are legally a food animal. And there are legal implications when selling eggs and meat from any animal that has received treatments. And the treatments, there's an approval process for treatments of various kinds in food animals. And unfortunately, most manufacturers of dewormers have not gone through the process to have their products tested and approved for use. So there are very few treatments that are actually approved for chickens. Most treatments that we do use are used what we call extra label, or you might have heard it called off label, and they need a veterinarian to approve them and provide direction and a prescription for the use in your birds. It's also very important to use the correct dose, the correct medication and duration and withdrawal time, because any deviation from that can cause issues with resistance among the worms themselves. Treatments are species specific, and I will, my next slide is a table of medications that are out there for deworming chickens. It does separate out what is approved versus what's not. Routine deworming is not recommended. So that is another big note here. This is something we used to do a lot, but it is known to breed resistance among worms and reduces the effectiveness of future treatments. So we only want to treat when there is an infestation present, and really only if it's causing actual problems for your birds. So like I said, we do have a list of dewormers that are used for chickens. Amprolium is something that's very commonly used, although I'm actually questioning whether it's technically approved. It's approved for use in feed. It's hard to buy in quantities that are meant for chickens, but that's a different problem. There is a fenbendazole that is approved for chickens specifically. It's Safeguard Aquasol. But it is important to note that it doesn't necessarily treat everything. And one really important thing is like something like roundworms. Any treatment for roundworms, you pretty much have to do it at least twice because nothing really affects the eggs of the roundworm in the chicken. But most of the things that we want to use are not FDA approved. They are used extra label, and it is important to look at what they will treat and what they won't. And this is to the best of my knowledge. Don't take it as gospel, but also understand. So like in fenbendazole, it's approved for use against large roundworms and against cecal worms. It is not approved for threadworms or gapeworm. Also not approved for tapeworm or flukes, and it only helps with some of those. So there's not one dewormer that works for everything, and you do have to kind of weigh your options. So you might find piperazine or wazine mentioned in older documents. That's something that used to be available and I believe was FDA approved, but the manufacturer pulled it from the United States. I don't know what their reasoning was. There is a link here too, if you want to kind of learn more about extra label drug use for animals. That's an AVMA resource. So in summary, we really want to focus on prevention. That's the key to helping keep our birds safe and healthy. Remember that internal parasites are host specific. So just because your chickens have coccidia does not mean that your goats are going to get sick from it. If you've got goats and chickens together, they both can get coccidia, but it's not the same one. Parasites can negatively impact the bird's health. Clinical signs, unfortunately, are often non-specific. We have very limited treatment options, and to protect the options that we do have, we want to deworm only as needed and not deworm on a schedule. There are some additional resources that I have linked here. These all were active working links as of yesterday. Hopefully they are still active working links. But these are a couple of different sources. One thing I will always encourage anytime I talk to people about trying to search for reliable information is kind of note the extension on the websites that you're looking at. So you'll see a lot of blogs that talk about all kinds of natural dewormers, this, that, and the other. Those are not particularly reliable sources. Typically, we're going to look for .org or .edu. Now you'll notice I've got two .coms. So .org are usually like organizations that have, oftentimes they're kind of educational. .edu is always going to be from pretty much universities. And here I've got two .coms. One's poultrydvm.com and the other is Merck vetmanual.com. Both of those are .coms that I do trust, because the sources are always are linked, but in general, be a little wary of .com links, especially ones trying to sell you something. So we do have some time for questions. I'm going to leave my last slide here is contact information for me if for some reason you want to ask me more questions. We do have a Facebook for our university poultry that's trying to be pretty active, and we try to make sure that there's kind of different information. Right now there's snow pictures of critters walking through critter footprints. But yeah.
Thank you, Tatiana. That was great. A lot of information there. There are a couple questions in the chat already. If anybody else has questions, please add them there at this time. So the first question is, what is the recommendation for vaccination against coccidia?
Yeah, so it is possible to vaccinate for coccidia. I'm going to stop sharing my screen because we don't really need to see it. There is a vaccine that's available. I don't know that it's available really to small producers. And so it's part of why I didn't really mention it, because it's not something that's going to be easy to get your hands on. So it exists, you can use it, but I don't know that you're going to be able to access it. It's used commercially, but I don't know if that really answers the question.
Yeah, it is hard to get a quantity small enough to try and vaccinate for small flocks. And again, the way that has to be done is it's kind of what